Hi, welcome to the Midtown Vineyard Podcast. We're so glad you've joined us online. For daily encouragement, events, service times, and more, check out our website and social media. And now, this week's message.
Well, about the time I was 4 or 5 years old, I have a confession. I drank kerosene. I know. You're like, we knew something was off with him, and now we totally know what. I drank kerosene. And let me explain why, by the way, before you start judging me. Where I grew up in Connecticut, back before the laws of risk management and the Federal Food and Drug Administration and whatnot, people just kept barrels of kerosene in their backyards, right? Today it's used as jet fuel, which you're like, that makes sense too. Widely used to power jet engines, to send rockets to the moon. But back then, back before we knew more about it, people would use it to heat their homes. Now we have central heating and air. Back then we had kerosene heaters. And as I remember it, and by the way, how much can you actually remember from when you're like 4, 5, or 6? But as I remember it, I was in the backyard. I was playing baseball with a friend. We all got really hot, really sweaty, and we looked around for something to drink. And I was thirsty, and there as I looked around, I saw this big barrel that clearly had something in it that the owner did not want someone else to drink, because they wrapped a chain around it, like all around it, and then at the nozzle there was a padlock, clearly indicating that whatever was inside was delicious, right? They did not want it to be stolen. And 4 or 5, 6-year-old Tommy, I don't remember how old I was, 4 or 5, 6-year-old Tommy looks at this thing and goes, oh, I have to have that, right? Nowhere in my 4, 5, 6-year-old brain did I go, this is poison. I probably shouldn't drink it, right? Instead, I'm like, how do I get inside? So with my friend, we move over to the barrel. We start sliding this tight chain around, trying to loosen it, trying to expose the nozzle so that I could get what was inside out. At no point did we think this is probably dangerous. And at some point, we got the nozzle exposed. And as you can imagine in your mind's eye, a picture of a 5-year-old Tommy bending over, contorting his body so that his mouth could catch falling poison, that his friend is water falling into his mouth, right? That's exactly what happened. And as distant and as foggy and spotty as childhood memories are, for me, that's where whatever notion of a memory I have stops. The credits roll. Screen goes black. I remember nothing after that. I do remember this part, and then I remember waking up in what I now know was a hospital room, a crib, cradle, something in there, and going, what happened? Found out later, they had to pump my stomach, right? Clearly. And anyone who recognizes now how fidgety and busy I tend to be, you go, I knew it. I knew he drank jet fuel when he was a kid. Now, let's say hypothetically, this is only a hypothetical, but let's say hypothetically, like this becomes part of my origin story, and along about the time I start having children, which was about 30 years old for me, I'm annoyed by the fact that not only am I allergic to poison, but they're allergic to poison too. And so not only do I begin microdosing kerosene, but I start feeding kerosene to my children, hoping that somehow they'll develop the ability to metabolize the kerosene or change the chemical compounds of the kerosene in the tank from their own stuff. No, you're looking at me like I'm crazy, because this is crazy. This notion is crazy. You'd have me locked up, and it's humorous too, and it's absolutely ludicrous. We know that it's ludicrous when it comes to a chemical, right? We know it's ludicrous when it comes to poison. We know it's ludicrous when it comes to kerosene. Why is it then that it doesn't feel so ludicrous when it comes to our behavior towards other people? And here's what I mean. Some of us stay in unhealthy relationships. Some of us stay connected to toxic people. Some of us stay in patterns of dysfunction and abuse, exposing ourselves to poison, because somehow we think that by allowing ourselves to be exposed to that poison, we may somehow change or manipulate the other person into behaving correctly. We think we can change their chemical composition. And I'll use some examples, whether this is the wife who's routinely subjected to her husband's addiction, even though she knows he shows no signs of changing, no decision or desire to change, and the devastation of his choices and his impulses, his lack of self-control, it's ruining her. And she's somehow getting herself tricked into thinking that if she just hangs in there long enough, if she just loves long enough or hard enough, if she just tolerates long enough, then maybe somehow those actions on her part will somehow transform him into the person he needs to be. Or it's the family who every holiday season goes into the holiday visits knowing there will be those voices, those searing comments, those cutting condescensions, those little jabs and criticisms at every opportunity. And though it's destroying us, though it's ruining our peace, though it's hurting our marriage, though it's destroying our family and our home, what can we do? They're family. And what's more, aren't we called to be peacekeepers? And so maybe we're just to bear with it and bear with it long enough. Maybe, oh maybe, if we do, they will see the error of their ways and somehow they'll change their attitude toward us. Or it's that close friendship that used to bring you so much joy, so much peace, the one that when it started out, there was so much trust and truthfulness and transparency and tenderness at its core, but somewhere along the way it turned toxic. Where there was trust, there's now lies. Where there was once truthfulness, there's now deception. Where there was once transparency, there's now concealment. When there was once honesty, there's duplicity. And over and over again, this has drained you and hurt you and stolen from you something good, but you're now powerless against it. You can't leave the friendship, right? What if your voice in their life is the only one that's keeping them from going off the deep end? And by the way, wouldn't that be unforgivable? So you just hang in there hoping that your perseverance or your forbearance somehow will change the other person and cause them to contribute positively to the relationship once again. Guys, we are drinking poison and hoping the other person changes. And what's to make matters worse? You're like, we can make matters worse? Yeah, we can get confused even more because we can begin feeling trapped in these cycles because of things Jesus said. Things that Jesus said can actually make us think that this is okay, right? Because didn't he say turn the other cheek? Aren't we just supposed to put up with stuff like that, right? Didn't he say go the extra mile? Didn't he say if somebody asks you for your cloak to give your tunic also? Jesus seems in full favor, right, Tommy, of allowing yourself to be taken advantage of, allowing yourself to be mistreated, allowing trust to be violated time and time again. And though I'm trying to rebuild my life, though I'm trying to start over with God supplying and empowering me to rebuild in the wake of devastation, these offenses, these distractions, these violations and hurts are simply things I have to put up with, right? I'm glad you asked. To answer this, we're going to begin looking again into Nehemiah's story that we've started several weeks ago. So if you have your Bibles, open up to Nehemiah chapter 4. If you don't have a Bible, you can raise your hand. Pastor Jay is standing armed and ready with Bibles. We want you to be able to see it together. We began this journal entry, which is what it is. We've been looking at this story of Nehemiah, who had this huge mess that needed his attention. He lived 400 years before Jesus. His story was added to the Hebrew Bible later. It was such a remarkable story that the ancient Jews said that needs to be in there. He was a Jewish exile living in Persia. You may remember this as way of catch-up. The emperor had given permission to all of his relatives to move back to Jerusalem. They'd been exiled in Persia. He gave a directive that they could move back to Persia and begin rebuilding the wall to the city of Jerusalem. Nehemiah stays in Persia, but his relatives go back and begin rebuilding. But then they come to visit one day, and he says, how's the work going in Jerusalem? And they say, oh, not good. We can't get the wall up and running again, which for a capital city back then, for any city, this is not only dangerous, but it's humiliating to not have a wall to your own city. And it so breaks Nehemiah's heart that he takes a huge risk, and he asks the emperor for permission to take an extended leave of absence and go back to Jerusalem and help with the rebuild, which is exactly what he gets permission. He goes, he begins building this wall with people working with him. And it's an inspiring story about leadership. It's an inspiring story about God's strength. It's an inspiring story that has no miracles in it. a lot like our lives, just resiliency and focus upon God. And in a couple weeks ago, we saw as they are rebuilding, there's come to be hecklers. There come to be people who are trying to stop the work, that are making fun, that are throwing insults. And in today's passage, we're going to see those hecklers are actually going to move from heckling to posing a great physical threat. And we're going to see Nehemiah's reaction and learn something about the reactions that we're called to as we rebuild our lives. Nehemiah chapter 4. See, I gave you enough time to turn there. It's a little book. It's going to be hard to find. Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 7, what we read in the call to worship this morning. But when Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod paused, these are the enemies to the work, right? These are the combatants. These are the ones who are against what Nehemiah and the Jewish people are doing. These are the ones who love exploiting their broken wall, who are used to being able to raid and invade because the wall is broken. They're not happy that the work is moving on. When Sanballat, Tobiah, the Arabs, the Ammonites, and the people of Ashdod heard that the repairs of Jerusalem's walls had gone ahead and that the gaps were being closed, things are working well, right? They were very angry, right? Yeah, so the wall is being rebuilt, and it's a continuous work now. There's progress being made. These opposers, these enemies in the past, they've been able to just heckle people off the wall. All it took was a little intimidation, but for Nehemiah, the intimidation doesn't work. He just keeps going, and when these guys see that they actually might be able to rebuild their life, they are not happy. Same might be true of you. They all plotted, verse 8, together to come and fight against Jerusalem and stir up trouble against it. So as the work progresses, the enemies become more serious. They didn't just complain or mock anymore. They're now threatening and planning for violence. One translation says they attempt to create confusion. That might be what yours says. This is an important strategy of our enemy. Did you know that? Where you see confusion, you see him. He wants to create confusion among the people of God. Confused people will never move forward to fulfill God's work. They're usually confused but because they're distracted by the tricks of their enemies instead of focusing on God and his promise. And Nehemiah shows this amazing focus upon God and his promise. Verse 9, but we prayed. Don't you love Nehemiah? Don't you love his prayer life? Don't you love that his answer, his response to everything is to pray for? He just prays before he does anything else. But we prayed to our God and posted a guard day and night to meet this threat. Nothing would make them stop depending on God through prayer. They might have given up, might have believed the attack was a failure on God's part, but instead he immediately turns to God because he has more trust in God than that. And what's interesting is God allows this attack to go on in the first place. He could have shut it down, but he allows this rumor of an attack to go on, and it causes Nehemiah to go back to him in prayer because God is delighted when we draw to him in response to the attacks in our lives in prayer. But what's so interesting too, and I hope you caught this, they prayed to God and posted a guard, right? The and. They didn't just pray. They prayed and. You know, sometimes we can hide behind our prayers, can't we? We can pray about something but not actually do anything. They prayed and they got back to work. Like they prayed and did something. They used sanctified common sense, right? What should we do? They prayed and they responded. One of my favorite verses in the Bible, maybe one of yours too, we see it all the time. Such a great verse, right? We love it. We put it on all our Jesus Junk t-shirts and bumper stickers and coffee mugs and all the stuff, right? That verse from when Moses is leading the people out of Egypt and they're going up to the Red Sea and the Red Sea hasn't yet parted and Moses turns around and on the horizon he sees the Egyptians on their horses with their spears and their chariots because Pharaoh has changed his mind. And Moses doesn't know that the Red Sea is going to part, does he? He's got his back to the Red Sea. He's looking at the Israelites who are looking at him going, oh, good. You brought us out here to let us die, right? That was what they were thinking. He can see, they can all hear the hooves on the horizon, the hooves in the distance. And then Moses, half his face painted blue, the other half painted white, gives this great line with his hands out. Remember what he says? Exodus 14:14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Control P print, put it everywhere. Sweatshirts, bumper stickers, coffee mugs. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. Great verse. I love it. No one ever prints verse 15 and puts it on Jesus' junk. You guys ever look at verse 15? Immediately following the scene, Moses, blue and white face, back up against the wall, hands out, the Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. The scriptures say, then he turns around and he looks up at God, and God goes, what are you looking at me for? You know what to do. Go. The sea hasn't parted yet. And God ain't going to part it until Moses takes a step, but he does have to take a step. And God says, I think you're hiding behind this prayer right now. I'm glad you prayed, but you're also to do. Don't just pray. Act. I guess that's why he invented highlighters. In Nehemiah's story, Nehemiah prays, and I love that. His first response to everything is to pray, but then he also acts. It wouldn't be hard to imagine some of the people there going, Nehemiah, we don't have to post a guard. Nehemiah, come on. We don't have to do all this, right? We prayed about it. It's good to go. Like he goes, we're not going to just pray about it. We have to set a watch. God will protect us, but he needs to find us doing our duty before him. So set the guard. When you see an area of your life that needs attention, it isn't enough to just pray about it. You also have to set a watch. You have to give special attention and accountability to that area. And then notice too, he doesn't just set a guard, but he does it day and night because he's determined and he's not going to turn back. He sent a message to God with this behavior saying, God, I am committed. We are committed. This behavior sends a message to the enemies. We are committed. We're not afraid. We're going to keep going, right? And it sends a message to the people of God saying we can count on God. Verse 10, meanwhile, the people in Judah said, the strength of the laborers is giving out, and there's so much rubble that we cannot rebuild the wall. Now pause. Judah, you may know this, was one of the tribes of Israel. And Judah is supposed to be the strongest, bravest tribe. This is the tribe that the Messiah himself would come from. So it's a special challenge and a special discouragement to have this word of discouragement come from who's supposed to be your bravest tribe, which indicates something. The people are tired. They're worn out. They're fatigued. They're discouraged. They've been working hard, and they're losing heart a little bit, aren't they? You ever been there? Nehemiah and the Jewish people, they've been rebuilding and they've been standing strong in the face of attack after attack after attack after attack. And they've done well. You've done well. But you get a little worn out from time to time, don't you? Like, come on, God, this is hard. I'm weary. Can the waves just stop hitting? The rebuilding work here is at the halfway point. Discouragement sets in. Things feel chaotic. This is too much. There's too much debris, they say. There's too much debris around here. I can't go on. Isn't it true that the most dangerous place in a journey is that halfway point? Because so much remains to be done, and yet fatigue from what you've already done has set in. The work of rebuilding the walls is not only construction too, but it's also demolition. It's a clearing away and a hauling away of rubbish and debris. The ruins of the wall, lying in waste for 100 years, had collected trash and rubbish, and they begin to lose sight over it. They begin to lose heart because that has to be hauled off. And isn't it true in our act of rebuilding? When we're starting over, You guys may remember as we started this study of Nehemiah, do you remember how we got here? We started 2024, all the way back in January. Remember, all the way back at the beginning of the year. We started 2024 by studying the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John ends with a famous conversation between Jesus and Peter. And so after the Gospel of John, we moved from Peter's story into 1 Peter and then into 2 Peter as we followed Peter through the New Testament. And in Peter's letters, he talks about when you're living life following Jesus and he allows some kind of disruption into your life to shake things loose, to move through that rebuild. How do you do this? How do you progress from the first half of life, John 21, to the second half of life? As you go from when you were younger to when you were older, how do you follow Jesus through the changes? Because those changes are allowed by him to purify you. Those changes are allowed by him to make you different, to make you new, to conform you to his image. And so then from there, as we finished Peter's letters, we moved into, it's like, let's follow that theme of rebuilding. Because you're rebuilding. You've been through some things, haven't you? You've been through some shattering, some hardship, some loss. And in our act of rebuilding, sometimes some of the stuff that's been carried with us needs to be removed. Those piles of trash and debris and rubbish need to be pulled away. Taking out the garbage can be discouraging work. But isn't it true, too, that we have to go down before we can go up? Rubbish and distractions, unhealth, patterns of unhealth must be cleared away. We must go down before we can go up. Building or adding on, starting a new life, it's much easier and more fun than hauling off broken patterns, isn't it? When you clear away rubbish, you're vulnerable too, because those things worked for you. You can imagine the people saying, guys, you're clearing out trash. You're just making it more open for our enemies to attack us. Like, yes, it's mountains of trash, but at least we can hide behind it, right? Don't we sometimes love our cages? Don't we sometimes love those things that we know don't work, but still feel familiar, and so they feel comfortable? Your nervous system will always crave what's familiar over what's unfamiliar, even if it's broken. And God goes, I need you to haul that stuff out of there, right? Stop loving the cage that you're trapped in. Sure, there's mountains of trash. Fatigue is setting in. I need you to keep pushing. Keep going. Verse 11, also our enemy said, I love the also there. It's like, this isn't enough. We haven't been through enough, Lord. Also our enemy said, before they know it or see us, we will be right there among them and we'll kill them and put an end to the work. So this seems like it marks sort of the lowest point in the spirits of those doing the work. Things were already in a bad state. The discouraged workers feel like giving up. And now the enemy plans to raid the workers and to close in on them. It says they will neither know or expect anything, right? It's doubtful that the enemies know how discouraged the people are. It's doubtful that the enemies know how fatigued and worn out the people are. But guess who does know? You have an enemy to your soul who knows when you're worn out. You have an enemy to your soul who knows when you feel beaten down. And though the enemies in this story may not have overheard how discouraged the people are, it would not shock me if they were somehow inspired by those voices saying, now's the time to attack. Their guard is down. They're tired. Don't delay. You can crush him. You can crush them. The attacks we suffer from spiritual forces of darkness are just as strategically timed. And as we talked about last week, the storms that are sent sometimes can be demonically animated, perfectly timed for when your guard is down. But when your guard is up, God's enemy will see little victory. It says the enemies are going, kill them, and then you can cause this work to cease. And I kind of highlighted that too. Circle, underline, highlight that. Because what that says, it's kind of a backhanded compliment, isn't it? Kill them, and then the work will cease. Why? Because the only way to stop them is to kill them, right? I mean, they see how dogged they are. Like, we're committed to this. And so the only way to stop them is to kill them. Can the same be true of you? It's be said of you? Like, are you so committed to following Jesus that the only way to stop you would be to kill you? Or would it just take some discouragement? Would it just take some fatigue? Verse 12, then the Jews who lived near them came and told us 10 times over, wherever you turn, they will attack. This is a wonderful example of the power and the goodness of God. The enemies of God did their best, but God was always in control. The enemies did not know that they were being overheard by the Israelites. And so the Israelites, they hear the plan, and they go, and Nehemiah says, they told us 10 times over, right? An attack is coming. Our enemies will defeat us. And so how does Nehemiah respond? He could have panicked. They were in a panic. They told me 10 times over, right? They were in a panic. But here Nehemiah gets to display not panic, but faith in God. Look at his response to this report. Verse 13, therefore I stationed some of the people behind the lowest points of the wall at the exposed places, posting them by families with their swords, spears, and bows. After I looked things over, I stood up and said to the nobles, the officials, and the rest of the people, don't be afraid of them. Don't be afraid of them. And look at this. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome. And then fight for your families, your sons and your daughters, your wives and your homes. He could have panicked. He could have frozen. He could have doubted God and his goodness. Instead, he wisely trusted God amidst the storm. He did practical things that God would have him do anyway to claim the victory. And God had Nehemiah command them to bring out their armor. He's like, it's time to get serious. It's time to fight twice as hard. I know you're fatigued. I need you to hang in there. I need you to fight. Don't be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, great and awesome. Isn't that amazing? Like Nehemiah puts things in perspective. Like, yeah, our enemies are many, but our God is bigger. He is great and awesome. And then he reminds them to fight for their families. Some of you guys are breaking systems. Some of you guys are breaking cycles. Some of you guys are breaking generational curses, not just for yourself, but for your families. Who are you fighting for? Who or what are you rebuilding your life for? As tired as you are, I know you're tired. As tired as you are, whose future actually hangs in the balance? This is great motivation to keep going. When our enemies heard, 15, that we were aware of their plot and God had frustrated it, we all returned to I love this. We all returned to the wall. That was the win for Nehemiah, right? Not that the plot had been frustrated. It would be easy for him to take a W there and be like, we won, we frustrated the plot. Nope. The real win was that they were able to get back to rebuilding, because that's the goal. That's what their focus is on. When we're under attack, it's easy to feel that just enduring the storm is the victory. But the attack often comes to prevent your progress. Isn't that true? And victory is enduring the attack and continuing your progress. From that day on, verse 16, and this is kind of, if you heard nothing else I've said, this is the build up to, you're like, this is where the message starts. From that day on, half of my men did the work, while the other half were equipped with spears, shields, bows, and armor. The officers posted themselves behind the people of Judah who were building the wall. Those who carried materials did their work, circle, underline, highlight, with one hand and held a weapon in the other. And each of the builders wore his sword at his side as he worked. Guys, isn't this how we're called to rebuild? A sword in one hand and a tool in the other. To be on the offensive and defensive. Like, isn't this a beautiful, it's so poetic about that kind of guard that we're to have as we go about the work of rebuilding our lives, starting over, starting this new thing. God inspired. The slate has been washed clean. You've gone through some stuff. Peter says you've been through the fire. You've been purified. You've been called to start something new. You're starting over. He goes, don't be naive. You carry an instrument, a tool in one hand to do the work, but a dagger in the other, because you are rebuilding your life, perhaps even for someone else. We said early in this series that the wall you're building is a great work. You are doing a great work, and every day you work on it, you are writing the story of your life. So you better write a good one. Write one that you want told about you by someone else, because for some of us, someone else hangs in the balance of it, and it's hard, and I know you're tired, and you're vulnerable. And your fatigue is setting in because what's familiar feels better than what's new, and you've been through some stuff. You've been through crisis and loss and devastation and hardship, a clearing out of who you once were. A broken trust. Have you ever had your trust broken before? Ever had to rebuild from that deep place of hurt and betrayal? It's maybe the worst kind, isn't it? It's a different kind of sting, a different kind of ache. In Dante's Inferno, the worst part of hell is reserved for betrayers because it hits different. It's a sharper ache. And unfortunately, it's an inevitable part of life. When you risk being very known, you dare and you risk being very hurt. In this story, the Hebrew people have the daunting challenge of rebuilding the wall to their city amidst opposition. Their critics try everything to shut it down. And on the day that Nehemiah learns of a physical attack, a physical threat, he prays, step one. He posts a guard. I love that. He prays, and then he posts a guard. It's the same word as Proverbs 4:23. You guys know that verse? Solomon commands that you are to, he says to guard your heart. Guard your heart above all else. The same word in the Hebrew is to watch, to keep, to preserve, to protect from danger. I think for many of us, we think that following Jesus implies a certain naivety on our part, right? A Pollyanna view of the world. Being okay with being robbed or taken advantage of or betrayed or manipulated. And just allowing it time and time again. No boundaries to ever prevent future attack from would-be opposers because Jesus said, turn the other cheek, right? Jesus said, offer your tunic. Jesus said, go the other extra mile. And so we're called to forgive constantly. We're called to forget. We're called to invite anybody and everybody back into these new lives we're rebuilding, back into this city that you're creating because you're so kind and you're so generous and you're so joyous. But interesting that Nehemiah commands the people to build with a tool in one hand and a weapon in the other. Why? Because not everybody can be trusted in this season. And that's not unloving to admit. Following Jesus, allowing God to help you rebuild the wall of your life doesn't mean failing to recognize that. You are to guard your heart. Because not everybody who wants into your city has the best in mind for you. Not everyone is for you. Not everybody who wants access to your heart can be trusted with access to your heart. Not everybody has proven their responsibility to steward that access well. Some relationships are just toxic, and it's okay to recognize that. There's people in our lives whose decisions hurt us, people who can hijack our peace or send us spiraling emotionally, right? People who, man, we hang in there because we're so in love with their potential, but who they are right now, it's like it keeps taking something from us. We fear people's choices, and we suffer because of what they do. In his book, When to Walk Away, author, pastor, theologian Gary Thomas writes, the person who continues to break your heart isn't in a place to properly care for your heart. And your heart is vulnerable. Your heart's to be guarded. You've gone through some stuff. You're in a new season now. You're rebuilding. And in order to guard your heart effectively during this rebuild, you must identify who those enemies of your heart are, and you must guard your heart. And it's not always going to be easy to identify the would-be assassins. But it's not unbiblical to try. It's quite the opposite. What if these Hebrew workers hadn't identified that they had enemies? What if they just assumed everybody who wanted to come into their city, everybody who wanted to come into their wall, just deserved to be in there? There's no recognition, no identification, no boundary that they have to cross. No, these workers had a boundary that had to be crossed. And we need boundaries too, don't we? As we rebuild. Your love can be unconditional. Relational access never should be. Some people want into your city just to blow things up. Because there's an enemy of your soul. And he'll send people in there just to blow things up. Some people just drain you, don't they? betray you, violate your trust over and over and over. They show patterns of the opposite of one author calls what you need from your closest people. Trust, truthfulness, transparency, tenderness, and teamwork. Your closest people. And when that's violated and violated and violated, somebody proves to you they can't be trusted with that relational access. It's not loving to refuse to recognize that. You can't enable bad behavior and call it love. Can't tolerate destructive patterns and call it love. Can't pride yourselves on being loyal and long-suffering in relationships when really you're just perpetuating abuse and violence and then call it love. You can't build a trust that keeps being broken. And we can't confuse the good commands to love and forgive with the bad realities of enabling and covering up things that are not honoring to God. Because you're rebuilding and you have a heart worth protecting. And you've been called to be wise. Jesus said, be gentle as doves, yes, but he also said what? Wise as serpents. And some relationships require boundaries. There's a boundary for these workers, isn't there? An actual physical wall that separates them from their would-be assassins. And should that boundary be crossed, they carry weapons to keep them safe. During this rebuild, it might not be so easy to identify the would-be assassins of your heart, but that's why we carry the weapons. Boundaries are never about trying to manipulate another person into changing. Did you know that? Boundaries are about keeping you safe during your rebuild. They're biblical. And they're not there to try to change someone else. That's manipulation. These workers didn't carry weapons so that they could attack the people around them. They carried weapons to protect themselves. We would be wise to do the same. Establishing boundaries keeps us from being tirelessly manipulated or hurt or violated or abused. And yes, turning the other cheek is biblical, but boy, there's a whole lot to that you should go look up. I don't have time to chase it right now. But we use that out of context a lot. The bottom line is Jesus didn't enable people. Jesus didn't beg people. He didn't accept excuses for sin or let people off the hook because he thought they were mostly good. He had compassion for people and offered salvation to all. Still, those who reject his gift and refuse to acknowledge him as Savior don't get to enter into heaven. That's a boundary. If you read the book of Luke and count how many times Jesus walked away from someone or allowed someone to walk away from him, you'll find 41 examples. Not all of them were toxic people, but still the implication is clear. Jesus practiced good boundaries so that he could stay focused on his mission, and we would do well to do the same. Not to try to change someone else, but to keep us focused. Trying to change somebody else would be like me drinking kerosene, hoping the chemical composition in the barrel changes. Am I right? I mean, you can't change it. You would call me a bad father if I started feeding it to my kids, hoping that it would, like, right? And sometimes we have that view of God, like God expects us to drink poison. No. That whole turning the other cheek thing, he's like, you're missing the point there. Boundaries are good. I wouldn't expect you to drink poison in hopes of something. He's like, man, what kind of father would I be? You guys would think I was gross if I did that. And Jesus said, though you are wicked, like you would never do that as earthly fathers. Why do you think your heavenly Father would do that? So establish boundaries. Carry a weapon. Guard your heart. Continue the work. Don't get distracted. Health cannot bond with unhealth. You can't build a trust that keeps being broken. People who are irresponsible with your heart shouldn't be granted access to your heart. And you're rebuilding. And God gave his son for that rebuild. So be wise. Sometimes in order to move into deeper seasons of the rebuild, you have to, can I just be honest? You have to let certain people go. And that's hard. to let them walk away, but the relationship isn't sustainable. But you're not abandoning. I think my favorite lyric from any Bob Dylan song ever. You're like, I did not see that coming. Like, that's not the next sentence I was bracing for. My favorite Bob Dylan song is the song, Don't Think Twice, It's All Right. And in it, he says, so long. Where I'm bound, I can't tell. Goodbye is too good a word, babe. So I'll just say fare thee well. And I love that. Goodbye is too, is there any such thing as a good goodbye? Maybe. Etymologically, the word comes from a 16th century phrase. That means God be with you. God be with you. God be with you. And it kept getting shortened and progressively shorter, contracting eventually to the phrase goodbye, but actually it means God be with you. I've been thinking about that a lot. Like for some people, we're releasing them to God and saying, God be with you. I'm releasing you because I have a work to do. And I can't get distracted. There's too much counting on it. There's an enemy who wants you tired and fatigued and worn out. And he wants you to start making some bad decisions as a result of all that. You got some enemies who want to storm the city. But you're doing a great work. Keep going. Don't get distracted. Don't come down. Lord Jesus, this is a heavy teaching. There's a good chance that for many of us, as we started thinking about all this, as we started thinking about these fare thee wells, it's a possibility someone came to mind. You felt that tension in your heart. It's heavy. Jesus, we thank you for giving us a new life, bought by your death on the cross. A new life that was inaugurated with your resurrection. This rebuild. And Jesus, it can get tricky. You know that. It can get exhausting. It can get confusing. But we so want to end well. Would you give us wisdom? For those in the room this morning who are tired and weary, fatigued, would you give strength, endurance, a reminder of who hangs in the balance, the systems they're breaking. Would you help all of us to use discernment? Be willing to lay things down and release people to you.
Thank you again for joining us online. We hope you enjoyed the message. To connect with us, you can follow us on Instagram or Facebook. For more information on who we are, check out our website, midtownvineyardchurch.com. We'd love to hear from you. Make sure you leave us a review or drop us a comment. Until next time, have a great day.